The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis, and as always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and boy, I'm telling you, it's almost the end of January, folks. Getting ready for the Super Bowl up in Minnesota. The Patriots, who I live about 8 minutes away from Gillette, but of course I'm a New York Giants fan growing up in New York. The rest of my kids and my family and everyone else in Patriots Nation is going nuts, just like they do for the Red Sox. But hey, I root for the Patriots. They're the third team I root for besides the Giants and the Dolphins. If they don't make the playoffs, I root for Tom Brady and company. I see them all year long when I go to training camp, and I see a lot of the Patriots walking around my town. So, hey, the Super Bowl's coming up. That means it's February, and that means that spring training's starting in another month, which I can't wait. A lot of good things are going on in baseball, and I'm so excited about that. But you know what? Normally there's that lull between football and then baseball spring training and pitchers and catchers. You got that weeks in February that, you're relegated to watching basketball, college basketball. I don't get into college basketball until the mid-March, and then it goes to April. It brings me into the early baseball season. But this year we got the Olympics. We've got some great stuff. In fact, next Friday we're going to have Tim Wendell back on the show to talk about the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team. Now, I was speaking to somebody the other day, and I think Russia is barred from this year's Olympics. So I said to him, look, what the heck is a Olympics, any kind of Olympics, without a Russian hockey team? So it's going to be very interesting. In fact, a few authors mentioned, a few newspapers also mentioned that the U.S. might take gold, but again, Canada's been the big story. I remind my kids who are old enough now that they were 2 years old when the United States went to the gold medal game against Canada and lost, that the U.S. hasn't had such good luck since 2002 and 2010. Last time we won gold was, of course, when I was 10 years old in 1980, but that's another story. But hey, we got Tom Stanton coming back to the show, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Ty Cobb and the Babe. That's right, Babe Ruth. And he wrote a fantastic book about a decade ago, Ty and the Babe, baseball's fiercest rivals, a surprising friendship, and the 1941 Has-Beens Golf Championship. Now, most of you who are in my Ty Cobb group, because I do have the Ty Cobb and the Dead Ball Era, and of course my book's coming out on Ty Cobb in the summer, along with Tris Speaker and the whole Dutch Lennon affair, which we'll get to during this broadcast. I'll be asking Tom some questions about it. His research for the book is impeccable. This is a book you should definitely go out and get. It's easy to read. It spans the career of both. It spans their friendships. Awesome book. I highly recommend it. And we'll get to Tom. We'll get to the book in about a minute, but you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho, and I just can't believe how the networks are growing. We got Nancy Finley, Charlie O's niece out in Oakland doing the show there. We got San Francisco and New York Giant baseball. We got Doug Gladstone, who wrote a bitter cup of coffee about the 900 former Major League Baseball players who played before 1980 who were denied a pension plan. He's getting his own podcast, and he'll be interviewing some of those folks who still are lobbying Major League Baseball to get that pension plan. We got Peter Golenbach. Yeah, the great Peter Golenbach. He does Golenbach's University. We got renowned sports writer Hal Bach, who was at the Associated Press for a long time, covered about 40 World Series in his day and about 24 Super Bowls. He's on Vintage Sports. We got Bill Kashadis down in Philadelphia doing Philadelphia baseball. Past, present, future. Not only focuses on the Phillies, but we go back to a time when they had two teams, like most cities did back then. the Athletics, that team that moved to Kansas City and then Oakland. So he does that. He does Negro League ball, and I'm telling you, the network is getting better every day. I'm honored to be a part of it, and hey, it's just good to be on the air to teach you folks the baseball stuff, because it's not everything you read or watch on TV that's important. What's important is that we deal with stuff that maybe you don't know, books you might have missed, authors' views, ex-players, and that's where the story is. You won't get this on ESPN, you won't get it on cable TV, but you will get it here on my show and the other shows that are on the network. Now, turning to Ty and the Babe, I've already given a great introduction to this. It's Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth, two icons. And I always say this, if I had a Mount Rushmore of baseball, there would be four people on Mount Rushmore there. Number one would be Ty Cobb, not because he started baseball. Baseball was there about 80 years before he got in, maybe 70. But he was the first superstar that put things on the map for baseball. Babe Ruth changed baseball, and this is what this book pretty much deals with, dead ball going into live ball, and we're going to get into the whole thing about that, because I always have questions regarding that. Then I'd put Jackie Robinson up there because he changed the face of America, gave rise to the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was only, 19 when Jackie came up into the majors, and Dr. King always attributes the civil rights movement for being Jackie Robinson. And, of course, one of my favorites, Marvin Miller, who changed the way baseball business is done. And those four guys would be on my mountain. And, of course, we got Ty and the Babe. We got author Tom Stanton, who wrote a lot of books. We had him on for that great book on the Detroit Tigers in 1934 to 35, and I had a blast. Terror in the City of Champions, Murder, Baseball, and the Secret Society that shocked Depression era Detroit. Go back into the archives on YouTube. You'll find the show. Fascinating book. It was nominated for awards back in 2016. It is a fascinating story of what we don't hear today, of a Ku Klux Klan kind of group running around in the Midwest. The story is intriguing. The Tigers are intriguing. The Red Wings are intriguing. The Lions are intriguing. Detroit is intriguing. And, hey, I'm not even from Michigan. Tom is. So, he's a real big Michigan guy. I'm just the guy who reads his books, and I could tell you Detroit was a major city back then. I think it was the fourth largest, and it was looming to grow even further. It was start from the Depression, but it is a fascinating story. Go out, get that book. Hey, Tom's a former Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan, and more Michigan, see? Stan teaches journalism at the University of Detroit Mercy. In 2008, Stanton won the Michigan Author Award. And without any interruptions, welcome to the show, Tom.
Hey, Ian. It's great to be back with you.
It's always an honor. You write so crispy, so clearly. The research is impeccable. The biggest thing I found in Ty and the Babe, from being a student of Ty Cobb and having my own site, being honored to have Charles Learson come on the show when his book first came out. Did you read A Terrible Beauty by Mr. Learson?
Yeah, I still need to read it. I've read bits and pieces. I've read some of the magazine works that he's done related to it, and I'm familiar with it. But I hate to admit this. I spend my days writing baseball books when I'm not teaching, and so when I do reading for fun, because you have to do a lot of reading for the research, as you know, when I do reading for fun, though, I tend to do non-sports stuff, so I need to get to it, and I've heard fabulous things about it, and I know Charles Charles kind of built on what I was getting at and what Richard Bach, an earlier Ty Cobb author, was getting at, which was the misrepresentation of Ty Cobb in more recent decades, the portrayal of him as this horrific human being. And he built on it. I'm happy he did, and he's had a lot of success, Charles has, in terms of helping turn around Ty Cobb's reputation, which was an unjust reputation, at least the way it developed in the last half century.
And you know something?
Quick answer would have been no. I've not read it, but I will one of these days.
Well, you know something, Tom? I was going to get to that point. You took the words out of my mouth. In your book, in 2007, I know Herschel Cobb, his grandson, was something around that time, too, about him. But I know you spoke to Cindy Cobb, I believe. I speak to her almost every day. I speak to Cindy Cobb because she always posts something in my group in Facebook, and she said to me, I'm so glad that you have this group. People are learning the real story of Ty Cobb and the era he played in, the dead ball era, and then I even go back to the 1800s because a lot of people don't know about this. But what I wanted to say is what you already said. You were advocating for Ty Cobb in an era, which is 10 years ago, where people believe the stuff that Al Stump wrote or maybe Charles C. Alexander wrote, and he is probably and I'm going to quote you, he's probably the most maligned figure in baseball after he passed on in 1961.
Yeah, I mean, Ty did not do anything to lower his own reputation, after he died, but it just kept plummeting. And as Charles pointed out, and as you know, and as I pointed out, 2007, that, it was Al Stump who wrote a rather scandalous portrayal that had a lot of scenes taking place just between supposedly Cobb and Stump, and thus unverifiable and exaggerated. And that grows into it starts with the magazine article he did back in the early 60s, and then a couple decades later goes into the book in which Stump portrays Cobb as almost a psychopath. And then that grows into the Ty Cobb movie, which exaggerates things even further. And it just, the reputation continued to swirl down to the point where somebody who was alive during Ty Cobb's playing days absolutely would not have recognized him based on the portrayal of him in our modern culture. And so it's an uphill battle to try to go against that. But what I focused on in Ty and the Babe, and the way I like to approach these things, is to try to bring people to life within their time period, and let people make their own judgments. But it's one of the reasons I began the book in 1939, and then we flash back to the baseball playing days, and then we come forward for the latter part of the book to the golf tournament. But I began it in 1939 as Ty Cobb is heading to Cooperstown, New York, for the very first Hall of Fame induction, where he is, of course, the top vote getter. And Cobb and his two youngest children, or teenagers, stop in Detroit, and they go to a Tigers game, and he socializes with lots of old friends. But the friendship that he most wants to reconnect, the friend he must reconnect, is a guy named Alex Rivers. And I opened the book with this because it confronts head-on, early on, the image of Ty Cobb as a flaming racist. And I'm not arguing that Ty Cobb was racially enlightened for his time. He had a lot of the same biases, I think, as other people in that era. But Alex Rivers is a black man, and there was a friend of his, and that's the guy. He feels his trip to Detroit is going to be incomplete unless he can get together with Alex. And finally they do meet in his hotel room before Ty Cobb takes off for Cooperstown by train. But I start the book with that intentionally because it instantly forces people, I hope, to confront the image of Ty Cobb that they're used to.
And you know something? It was interesting the way you started the book, because as we end up seeing when we see Learson's book, was that, first of all, yeah, he was born in the South. post-Civil War in 1886. And all of us think, well, Reconstruction ended, and they had the Ku Klux Klan running around in the Midwest and South. And you have this, the images, which of course was prevalent this year to take down the Confederate statues, they were all built after Reconstruction, either as a sign of defiance to the North or a symbol to the African-American population in the South saying, yeah, we lost the war. But we still hold these ideologies to be true. And, of course, you come around Plessy versus Ferguson, and, then, of course, 1954's Brown versus Board of Ed, by which Warren says separate and equal have no more. The South went wild. It wasn't until the mid-'60s, until the Civil Rights Amendments were passed, that blacks really won the Civil War 100 years after. And even after then, I remember growing up in New York City, that a lot of people were opposed to the busing of children into white neighborhoods because of just the pure racism that persisted. What was interesting about Cobb was he was not a racist. And in Learson's books, he makes notice that, look, his father was a professor. And Cobb didn't go to college, and he resented it because I know he invested in academics, and you had to get good grades, and we'll talk about him being a very, very good investor in Coca-Cola and other things. But Cobb himself was not a racist. And I was so glad you opened with that, because even before all this new information came around, you did your research, and I must commend you on it, that before all the stuff was coming out about Ty Cobb, and rolling back what Stump had done, you were already mentioning in here, dropping hints saying, hey, whatever you've seen in the past, that's not so true. Now, let me ask you this question. Stump had 2 books out. We know he wrote, co-authored the autobiography of Ty Cobb, and then 30 years later, he did the book, which was made into the movie with Tommy Lee Jones. Do you think the original autobiography is semi-true? Because he did flub a lot in it.
Yeah, it's an as-told to autobiography, and so those begin from a suspicious place anyway, but tends to be more of a glossing over stuff. So, it's been a while since I read it, because this book, as you noted, came out a decade ago. But and a lot of my most intense research was before that, obviously. So this is from memory, but it was written from Cobb's perspective, so it wasn't really Stump so much. It's not until Cobb dies that Stump writes that magazine piece about the wild ride with Ty. And that becomes the basis for Stump's book later on, when he's near the end of his life and, trying to economically set up his family, or at least give his wife a little bit more money to live on. Then he writes that book. But, I don't remember it well enough to go through it, chapter by chapter in terms of accuracy. But whenever you have an as-told to story, as any of us who have interviewed anybody really, but especially these old ball players knows, when you start to fact check specific games, it's often a little bit different from what they remember. I had this experience when I was working in my Hank Aaron book, where there were a lot of sources who were still alive, and if you, everybody tended to remember that Hank Aaron, the home run. These players would remember the game that Hank Aaron hit the home run, and it was always it always occurred in the 9th inning with the game tied, and then you'd go back and fact check, and it just wasn't true. We saw some memory errors in Hank Greenberg's autobiography written with Ira Burko. And I think that's pretty common, so I'm sure there's a lot of that with Cobb's book as well. It's inevitable when you're just relying on somebody's memory, but I can't offer a full-throated critique. Unfortunately, I don't remember it that clearly.
And what's interesting, because in the 90s, again, Stump wrote the book, before he died, like you mentioned, and it was so prevalent In the mid-2000s, when I was doing the research and some of the interviews you did for this book, Ty Cobb and the Babe, the thing is that some of these guys started out with the question saying, like, was Babe Ruth aware of Ty Cobb's racist attitudes? It was well believed, all this stuff, when your book came out.
Yeah, it is interesting to challenge it, but one of the reasons I did the book is, which I note in the intro, is if you're around baseball long enough and you start to hear the old timers speak, and I'm going back here, when I started writing baseball 20 years now, and so there were guys around at that point who had seen Ty Cobb play or had played with them, and if you're around baseball, you start to hear these old Cobb stories, the old Babe Ruth stories, and a lot of the Cobb stories begin with, well, I know what they say about Ty Cobb, but he wasn't like that to me, and I didn't see that, and and then they portray him as a very different human being from the image that had existed, and you hear that enough, and that's really what prompted me to really dig deeper and explore. Not only Cobb, but the relationship with Babe Ruth. Because, I was born in 1960, and so I came of age, baseball fan, late 60s, early 70s. And back then, we certainly appreciated Mantle and Hank Aaron and Willie Mays. But back then, in my childhood, the debate was still, who is the better ball player, Ty Cobb or Babe Ruth? And so I grew up as a baseball nut, living with these guys' reputations and as baseball players anyway. And even back then there was the image of Cobb as the guy with the spiking people indiscriminately kind of thing. But they were larger than life characters, and it was just fun to be able to return to that time and try to portray them accurately. It's a challenge, you're right.
And what's interesting is in the few interviews, and back then, I'm going to tell you some, what I realize now in interviewing authors for all new books, there aren't many book reviews or interviews published on the internet as there were, say, 10 years ago. One of the authors who was on my show, Todd Masters, I think he wrote the stuff on Detroit. He wrote about the 72 Tigers, right up your alley. And he wrote about Alan Trammell, and we had the show on Alan Trammell a week before he was voted into the Hall of Fame by the Veterans Committee. He's also from Michigan. And we were talking and we were discussing, and, Detroit really gets a lag when it comes to baseball heroes. You grew up, you had Mickey Lalich, you had Al Kaline, you had the Bird in 1976, who was unbelievable. Everybody wanted him to pitch in their ballparks to bring in revenue when the guy pitched. Ty Cobb was there. Greenberg was there. I would mention, what's his name, who won 30 games, Denny McLean, but, he went Ori. So I sometimes speak to McLean, his wife's sick and stuff, but the thing is that the legends of Ty Cobb were not true, whereas the Babe, when you look at the Babe's life and all the things that he did, including defying Landis, which you mentioned in your book, to go on a 1921 barnstorming, which he was suspended for the first 6 weeks, which gave Kenny Williams of the St. Louis Browns the home run title that year, because he openly defied Landis. He openly defied Miller Huggins' curfew. He was a playboy. We don't know what happened to him in 1925. You're right about the bellyache heard round the world. We know Ruth broke the law. He drank. He did all these terrible things, but he never gets vilified. Cobb, on the other hand, never gambled except for maybe twice, as he admitted on testimony when he was on trial in Landis's office for the Dutch Liner affair. He said he actually did put 2 bets on the 1919 World Series, and that's the only 2 times. But he invested his money. He was a good philanthropist. He did have problems with his wife and his children. Some were alienated for him. But how come, in your findings, we don't vilify the Babe?
He was such a lovable character, and of course he comes up during the time when guys like when sports writers like Grantland Rice are very much into the myth-making mode, and so you didn't focus on the negative things. I mean, there were mentions, but there was, they weren't played up the way that they would be played up today, and it was that Babe Ruth. He sold newspapers, sold magazines. He was so incredibly popular with fans, especially kids, and so they downplayed that other side of him. But it's interesting. I mean, Cobb and Ruth were on the same playing field for more than a dozen years, playing against one another. Cobb, of course, near the twilight of and the end of his career, and Ruth from the first days of his career. But it is amazing to think of. I totally lost my train of thought there, Ian.
That's all right. That's fine. I always lose my train of thought. That's the beauty of this show. You don't have to know what's going to come out of your mouth next.
Well, but and so we, the writers ignored a lot of the Babe Ruth stuff. But if you go back to the early 1920s, that was the point I was making. Is that it's Cobb, even though he's viewed today in these negative terms, it was Cobb back in the 20s who's viewed as the statesman of baseball. A very aggressive, competitive player, but, the dignified old-timer, the guy coming near the end of his career. Never call him an old-timer during his playing days. He was too talented even then. And it's Ruth, as you point out, who's the bad boy of baseball, getting suspended here and there, having these, paternity issues, having drunk driving accidents. One of the things that Ty Cobb learned, and Ty Cobb, as everybody knows, on the baseball field was a psychological warrior. And he would do anything to take even his friends off of their game to try to distract them. And he learned early on from some of his Baptist buddies on the Boston Red Sox that Babe Ruth got teased by some of his teammates there. Back then, you used to have divisions within the team itself between the Masons and the KCs, the Catholics and the Protestants. It was one of the divisions, and some of the Protestant guys used to teach Babe Ruth, who was rather, he was, even though he wasn't an orphan, he grew up in an orphanage. He grew up in a reform school, an industrial school, and he was the son of a barkeep, and his, he was kind of an uncouth guy. And so when he's a young ball player, he's been aggressively playing out on the field. His rookie time, comes in back from the field into the locker room, strips out of his sweaty underwear and clothes and takes a shower, comes back out of the shower and puts on that same sweaty underwear. And his teammates at that point start teasing him. And Cobb learns of this. And for the next many years, whenever he passes him on the field, just to try to take him off his game to get under his skin, he makes a reference about something stinking or something smell. Where's the pull tab? And it's all part of the design, but it kind of gives you a sense of, the difference in their upbringings. You mentioned that Ty Cobb was born to a father who was educated. The guy could read Greek and Latin, served as a mayor, a state senator, a school superintendent. And Ruth's dad was, this rough saloon keeper. And Babe was, essentially, to put it in unkind terms, he was really neglected, as a kid. And put away, because parents couldn't deal with him. His mom was having issues too. Put away in a place for troubled boys, essentially. both of their fathers, a couple things they had in common, both of their fathers died violently. Cobb's dad was mistaken, supposedly, depending on whose side you believe on that, but was mistaken for an intruder and shot by his wife, supposedly, when he was coming back into the home. And Ruth's dad died in a fight outside the bar. But the other thing that they had in common, which I'm not sure how often it's been mentioned, who else was reported, but the woman that Babe Ruth would eventually marry, his second wife, Claire, was a Southern girl who had dated Ty Cobb before she ever met up with Babe Ruth. So at the very least, they had a couple things in common, but they were very different personalities, real contrasts, and it is interesting to see how one of the guys, Cobb, has kind of been demonized over the years when it was really Ruth, as lovable as he was, this kind of circus bear performer, kind of Santa Claus who's a little bit naughty kind of image, is portrayed in a very different way. But I love how Babe Ruth is portrayed. I love Babe Ruth, the image and the myth. But it's unfortunate that we have to contrast Cobb in a different way to raise up Ruth.
And, it's funny because, Cobb liked his hobbies. There's no doubt, when I did the research for my book on the Dutch Lennon affair, Ban Johnson, and I'm glad you made reference to Johnson in your book because not a lot of people know about him, and he really is an important figure, probably the most important figure in baseball before Landis comes around as commissioner because, with him, he sent private detectives out to spy on Trispica and Ty Cobb to get a sense of their characters in gambling. And what the Pinkerton detectives brought back to Johnson was that, look, Cobb's not putting bets on anything, whereas Spica does. He puts bets on everything to show that Cobb's credibility was still good. Be that as it may, what people don't understand about Cobb is that he grew up, played the game in a different age than Ruth, even though it was 9 years apart, just the same like their age. He was born in 1886. Ruth was born in 1895, and Cobb started playing in 1905, which you mentioned his mother accidentally shot his father while creeping through a window, and then Babe started in 1914 with the Red Sox, but it was two different games. The dead ball era, again, they used one ball. The ball looked like a head of cabbage by the end of the ninth inning, if it even lasted that long. You can spit on it, you can drool on it, you could put paint on it, you could spray it with things, whatever it was, rub dirt into it. Ruth comes along, he's a pitcher, and then he changes stances. 1919, they get rid of everything. You cover the fact that in 1920, no spitballers anymore, but for 2 on every team. Now the ball has to be white. Two different eras. My question to you is, we're going from dead ball to live ball. Cobb never appreciated the live ball era because he was taught you slap the ball. It's more of a strategic game. It's not this thing that you hit home runs. Anyone could do that if you did right. And I think in one game in 1925, he hit 3 home runs. He's like, see, all you have to do is choke down on the bat. What's the big deal? Do you think that there was anything up with the ball or anything? Or you just think it evolved into that?
Yeah, I think you hit on a few of the things, but it's difficult to know. All these many years later, because that was such a dispute at the time, whether the ball had been brightened and livened up. Ruth was so far ahead, if you look at the statistics, though, of other people. Even when the home run becomes popular, Ruth's numbers are still far ahead of everybody else's season by season. You have more guys hitting 10 or more home runs in the season. You see those numbers increasing, but the differential between where he was and the guy who was second or third it's substantial. So there's stuff happening with Babe Ruth that just can't be attributed totally to a live ball. But what you get at is important. It's interesting now when you see people evaluating through new statistical measures the performances of Cobb and Ruth and diminishing them. And I understand that. I understand the war stat and the importance of other stats. But you have to recall that within Ty Cobb's time, the thing that they measured you on was batting average. And I know batting average is a very imperfect and not a very good statistic, but it's what they measured greatness on back then. And so that's what the players were playing for. And, if they had been measuring on base percentage, I'm sure Cobb would have been the leader of that. But he was playing during baseball science, which, as you noted, was placing hits. It was a run game. It was a lot more bunting. It was, being smart on the base pass, advancing runners. It was a different game. It was, at the time, described as the thinking way of playing baseball. And Cobb and others who practiced baseball science, the dominant way of playing the game, viewed the home run hitters, any buffoon can power a ball out. Where's the strategy in that? The thing that changed it all, though, was just how popular Babe was becoming when he started slapping these home runs. I mean, I like to, one of the things that was fun in the book is I documented every game that Babe and Ty played in together. And they brought out the best in each other. They had a rivalry. Cobb could see that Ruth was changing the game once he became a full-time hitter, and people were celebrating the home run. Ruth was just the toast of the town wherever he went, and fans loved him. And Cobb could feel the spotlight being stolen, and he didn't appreciate how the game was changing. But in that very first encounter that they had in 1915, Ruth had come to the major leagues in 1914 for a couple of games, but 1915 was his first full season. He was a pitcher for the Red Sox. And Cobb at that point was 28. He was beginning his 11th season. He was the biggest name in baseball. He's the guy who had all the endorsement deals, and they wrote poems and songs about Cobb. He had won his 8th straight batting title, and this was his first ever at bat against Ruth. And he singles in Detroit's first run, and he gets on base the next 2 times he faces Ruth. But the interesting little thing I'd like to point out is even in that first game against Cobb, we get a sign of Ruth as something more than a pitcher. He gets a double off the scoreboard at David Field, and you kind of have a little glimpse of what's to come with this power hitting guy. And it's a type of baseball that fans just are going to grow to love. It's an exciting kind of game, and it does, it does diminish what Cobb and other players of his era had been trying to achieve all that time. But it's important to remember and emphasize again is that what was celebrated back in Cobb's time was the batting title. And that's what that's what was celebrated. That's what you got rewarded big contracts for. And that's what he achieved. And so whenever you're comparing these players from different eras, it's a very precarious job, I think, because Cobb wasn't trying to accomplish a different kind of statistic. He was achieving what was valued at the time.
And what's interesting, you mentioned earlier that, look, part of the brilliance of Ty Cobb, and it really was brilliant for the day, was to play upon, the opposing player's weakness. With Babe Ruth, it was his underwear. But when he saw the game changing, and you point out very, very intelligently in the book, he's like, Cobb's like, I don't like where the game's going. Babe Ruth, he's either going to get fat. He can't keep this thing up forever. He considered home run hitting just a fad.
Right. Yes, he did. And he, some of it you can look at this, and I was trying to measure in the book whether it was what percentage was absolute sincerity and disappointment with the direction of the game, and what percentage was envy. As even in the Detroit papers, you can see Ruth being celebrated and, Cobb being diminished a little bit, that the torch has passed. You saw those kind of headlines. And so it had to sting Ty Cobb. But what percentage was, envy, and what percentage was just absolutely you believe the game should be played a different way? Obviously Ruth's way won, right?
I really don't know if Ruth won. Granted, I don't think Ty Cobb won a World Series. It was in two, I think.
Well, by win, what I mean is his way of playing is more celebrated. I think people prefer the power game.
Well, that's
over small ball. I'm a Detroiter, so I'm not ready to give up on Ty Cobb as the greatest player of all time yet. So
you even mentioned that at the end of the book, you would take Ty Cobb, whether you were biased or not. So I'm looking back on things. Look, what did Ruth have? A 340 something average or a 350 average when he retired? We had Ty.
You're talking Ruth, right?
Yeah.
Ruth was like 342.
Yeah,
I think.
It's not so shabby. Look, Cobb had a 360.
Oh gosh, no.
You belt 60 home runs and you hit 340. When Maris did that, he only hit 269.
Well, by the end of his playing days, Cobb had actually come to appreciate Babe Ruth and had seen that he was a smart ball player, knew that he was a talented ball player. He ended up proving himself. For a lot of years, they wouldn't deal with each other. They came to blows on the field. There was a riot during one of the Detroit games as a result of their animosity. It took Cobb a while, and he ended up managing the Tigers as well. And the years that he managed the Tigers, and he wasn't that great of a manager because he's a super talented player who couldn't really relate to some of these lesser lights being unable to achieve what he had achieved. But as manager of the Tigers, during those years, the Tigers beat the Yankees more than any other team beat the Yankees. And, Babe Ruth was likely to hit more home runs against the Tigers. Ty Cobb's average was higher against the Yankees during the Ruth years than the rest of the season. They rose to different levels of playing in terms of the competitiveness with one another. But one of the things Cobb was unwilling to do, you can see the change in how he views Babe Ruth right through the 1920s. So when he's manager of the Tigers in the early 20s, that first season, he does not want his pitchers. He thinks he can outsmart Ruth. He does not allow his pitchers to intentionally walk Babe Ruth. And then he pays a heavy price for that. He loses, there's 6 or 7 games that they lose as a result. And then he learns, and then over time he learns even more until finally around 1924, 25, they both have friends in common who are trying to get these two stars to deal a little bit better with each other. Try to get them to at least be cordial to one another. They're the two big lights in the game, and so you see the relationship evolve in the 1924 World Series, where both of them are paid commentators. They have those sports writers who are ghostwriting columns for them. But it's a relationship that does change over time. And later, they're never going to be best friends, but they are going to be, happy to see one another and come to care about one another, which is quite a change.
And that leads me into Cobb retiring later on in 28, but in 26, a lot of people don't know why Cobb left Detroit or went to Philadelphia. And like I mentioned to you in the beginning, I've just finished my manuscript on the whole Dutch Lennon affair, and it took a couple of years to do, and I had access to Landis's files, which on the subject, which was an amazing thing. I also was able to get Smokey Joe's unedited tapes from the Lawrence Ritter book, the Glory of Their Times, because he promised Wood he would never ever publish or let those tapes out to the public because Wood basically implicated Cobb and Speaker during that whole affair, which they were, like you mentioned. Landis didn't have the evidence to prove it. Leonard refused to come to Chicago. He already got the $20,000 from Van Johnson to pay off for the letters that were sent by Smokey Joe Wood and Ty Cobb. And so, 40 years later, Smokey Joe Wood, he says, look, I took the fall for both Speaker and Cobb. I would go to the ends of the earth for a Speaker. And again, you mentioned early in this broadcast that the Baptists stayed with the Baptists, the Catholics did this. Wood and Speaker were racist. Number one, they were both, he grew up in Pennsylvania, Wood, and Speaker grew up in Texas. And they were very racist against the Catholics on the Boston team, which had internal feuding, even in the 1912 World Series, which, again, Wood was taken out of that game. But his brother put a bet on the game because they thought Wood was going to pitch, but they switched it. Wood was always apt to this kind of gambling stuff. He was friends with Ty Cobb, and of course he loved Speaker like Speaker was his father. Speaker was only a few years older than him. But you mentioned in the book the Dutch Lennon affair. How much research did you do on that? Because it's only a few pages. I mentioned to Gerald Wood in his book on Smokey Joe. Not a lot of people did die-hard research on this. This is the fourth biggest scandal in history.
Yeah, no, I'll admit to have not dug deeply into it because it was not really what I was focusing on. So everything I was doing was kind of focused on the relationship. But I do mention it. But I'll be interested to hear what you have to say because it was difficult just on the amount of research that I had done to sort out what had actually happened. And it's always difficult when you're dealing with something that's more than now it's almost a century ago.
1926.
90 years, right? So, 90 years.
Yeah, 1990.
In terms of the actual betting, but then the scandal coming out in the, 26, 27. But, so I'll be interested. I did not have access to the materials that you mentioned, and so I did not dig deeply into it. It wasn't really the focus of what I was doing, but I look forward to reading what you had to say about it.
But I do mention Babe Ruth in it. And one of the things I mentioned about Babe Ruth was, again, we're going back to Ty Cobb's character. They asked Babe, which you put in your book, do you think Ty Cobb gambled? And he said, no, the integrity of Ty Cobb. When he played, he doesn't think he's going to throw a game. And it just shows more and more how things were fabricated over the years. Because what I found in my books through newspaper clippings and things that I've come across was Ty Cobb was loved by everyone in Georgia. And when he was asked to step down because of, he was blackmailed by Johnson that they'll never play, him and Speaker will never play in the American League. And people found out the reasons why. By December 23rd, when Landis did all the transcripts, he sent all the transcripts to the newspaper, they were holding vigils. They were having rallies for him in Georgia. They were having... They made dolls of Landis with a noose around his neck, I found out. And they loved Cobb, and everybody was divided on this issue, almost like O.J. Simpson. Everyone had an opinion on it. It was that big. It was that big all over America. Every newspaper, you go to newspapers.com, if you remember, and go to December 22nd all the way to Landis's decision a month later, which you put in your book. Hey, he let them ride a little bit because he had to go play with Van Johnson for the final killing, which I talk about in my book. Huge chapters on it in my book. And it's just amazing. It is so amazing. Even Cobb's wife, who wasn't very fond of Cobb, speaks publicly about, look, oh, yeah, I mean, it was that big. It was that big. It was, and people, and it's forgotten. Just like, I say it's the fourth biggest scandal, and I'm going to tell you why it's the fourth biggest scandal. Number one, people forget about the collusion cases of the 1980s, okay? That's going to be my next book, which I am already 300 pages into already. I go back into the 1870s. In the words of Marvin Miller, executive director of the Players Union, who was retired by then, so Donald Fair was the union chief, the collusion cases, by not investing in free agents and trying to break the free agency system, this was a conspiracy amongst all 26 clubs, all the owners, all their henchmen, all the officials, all the scouts, and that's a hell of a lot more than just 8 baseball players on a Chicago Black Sox team back in 1919. In Miller's opinion, collusion in the 1980s was the worst scam ever, and no book has ever been written about it, and, I have so much material on it. Dave Kingman I'm going to interview, Tim Raines I'm going to interview, Dawson I'm going to interview. The second biggest one was, of course, the Black Sox, which everyone thinks is the first. Then Rose, and then the Dutch Leonard affair. But we pick and choose to do Pete Rose and the Black Sox because it was probably the most remembered in both eras. Baseball is corrupt, 1920, during the World Series over there, which Smokey Joe Wood did say. There was betting going on during the 20 World Series in his tapes that I've got, whereas they both, Speaker denied it heavily, and yet he bet on the games when Cleveland played Brooklyn. So it's very, very interesting. As for Cobb, one would think, and I wrote in my book a lot of what you said in your book, he was a philanthropist. He invested his money. Why would he make a puny $2,000 bet when he was pretty much the first millionaire? And I'm sure your research showed the same thing.
Yeah, he was a smart investor. I mean, even before he invested, in Detroit, he learns about General Motors, and he invests in General Motors. Of course, being from Georgia, he knew about Coca-Cola and invested in Italy. Even before that, he was invested in real estate and futures, product futures, and he's just a smart money man all along. To the point when he dies in the early 60s, he has an estate that's back then in that day's money worth I think it was $11 million or more dollars, and he leaves of course sets up his family very nicely, but also leaves a lot for a hospital in his name, for scholarships that are still being given to this very day. And he did have philanthropy in mind. One of the interviews I did, just to kind of give you a sweet example of how his image has changed, is I interviewed a guy who was good friends with Ty's son, Herschel, who's a little boy who Ty took a liking to, and in 1925-26, his final seasons in Detroit had him come north with him and live at his house in Detroit and be his personal bat boy. Guy's name was Jimmy Lanier. And Jimmy, when you're doing a book like both of us have done, the details are important. And so I was digging, just I saw different references. Almost every article about Ty Cobb made some reference to his eyes. And sometimes they were gray, sometimes green, sometimes blue. And often the references were, and I know this sounds like it's a silly detail, but the references would be that they're icy or piercing, or it would be some kind of a very fierce description of the eyes. And I asked Jimmy Leonard, I said, I need to I need to track down this very minute detail, but you want everything to be right. You know, these details matter. I said, what color were Ty Cobb's eyes? And he said, oh, Mr. Cobb's eyes were blue, like a robin's eggs, he said. But it was such a gentle little reference. So I'm not sure how I ended off on that tangent. I apologize for that, Ian, but it's just kind of emblematic to me of how times can change somebody's reputation. But I do look forward to seeing what you have to say in your book about the whole scandal, and I'm particularly interested in the collusion one. Being a Detroit fan, Jack Morris was part of all that as well. So.
Yeah, Jack Morris, thank God he was able to get, again, two Tigers got into the Hall of Fame this year, Trammell and Morris. But, I have so many articles about Morris. And, Steinbrenner, he offered Morris, the deal to go to New York. Now, if he would have gone to New York, I think he would have had a better record. In 87, the Tigers went to the playoffs with the Twins, and the Twins ended up going to the World Series. But I think he would have had more success. Again, he was the best pitcher of the 1980s, Morris. And you got to give deference to the '91 World Series when he was on the Twins, going 10 innings in a seesaw game. And then right after the World Series, the black mark comes on Morris. 28 days after he wins the World Series, goes to Toronto. And then he wins a couple of World Series. So he's vilified in that matter. But I do believe if he was on a bigger stage than Detroit, and Detroit, really gets a bad rap, especially after the riots in '68. Your friend Tim Wendell wrote the Summer of '68, which I've had on my show. I know all about, the 70s and the decay, and, Detroit's now a city of like 500,000 people, down from about, 3 million in 1950. They're going to have to shorten the city and all their economic woes and all this stuff. But Detroit, to me, is a fascinating place because, they're a Midwestern town with a Northeastern mentality. I still think they're in the Eastern time zone, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, we are, yes.
Yeah, so they have that mentality. And, collusion, they were all part of it. And the Tigers especially, then you have Lance Parrish as well.
Right.
They colluded against him. But we'll get into that later on. I just want to finish up, just like you finished up in the book. There was a lot of material going on in 1941. Again, DiMaggio, 56th Street, hitting streak. You had Ted Williams up here in Boston hitting 406. But you had the golf thing going on here, which was widely covered in the press. You got the two old-timers. Here they come, Cobb and Ruth. Now, Ruth has played golf. He lived in Massachusetts. You make it known that he spent all his time, most of his free time, either, fishing or on the golf course. Ty, not so much, but here we are. We're going to meet. Right 1941, what's going on here?
Yeah, well, it's, it was an idea that was hatched because these guys had been compared during the baseball career so much, and even after their baseball career, but hatched in 1939 during that first Hall of Fame induction when Ruth and Cobb first come up with this idea of facing each other on the golf course, and Cobb being incredibly competitive, wanted to see if he could beat his old nemesis on the course. And, flash forward a couple of years, and it happens in 1941 as a benefit for the USO. And there's a romanticism that's involved with this, because these are two beloved players, former major leaguers, the most famous of all time at that stage. And so they end up with a series of golf matches, one outside New York, one outside Boston, one outside Detroit, covering the towns where they were stars. And it's just it's a wonderful tale, not only because they're mostly getting along, but also because Cobb is taking it much more seriously than Ruth is. And plotting ways to win, and it comes down to the rubber match in Grosse Ile, not far from Detroit, and I just enjoy it because of the way that these guys are celebrated many years after their playing days in Cobb's case, and it brings them back into the spotlight in a small way, and it allows me to finish the book on a very up note with these two guys on the golf course together, and having made their peace by that point, Cobb, once Ruth was gone, of course Ruth dies young. Once he's gone, he misses the guy. He misses his old enemy. He comes to, by then, to have seen him as a valued friend, a wonderful personality, and sometimes we don't realize how we cherish somebody until they're gone, and I think that was the case with Ty.
And you got the picture of Ty with the babe about a year before Babe died, and he basically has like tears in his eyes, Ruth, and you see Cobb dressed in his Detroit Tiger uniform, and these guys are now in his, he's 61, I think, at the time, Cobb, and Ruth is 52. He would die at 53, but it's iconic, that stuff. Just like you got the picture for the book on top, you see Cobb and Ruth looking at each other, but what's missing there is Speaker.
Yeah.
but missing there is...
I didn't hear that, but my publisher photoshopped Tetra Speaker out of that picture, but it was a baseball clinic that Speaker was actually hosting in Cleveland. He was the star attraction, and Ty and Dave came by. You're right.
I said, because you know why? I'm going to tell you why, and then we're going to end the show, and I'll ask you in about a minute if I left something out. People underestimate Speaker as a player, and the reason why they did was because he played center field in the shadow of Ty Cobb. You're talking about a guy who ended his career with a 345 average. Was probably the greatest center fielder ever in the game, Speaker. And he ends up with Ty Cobb on the Philadelphia A's with their idol over there, the tall tactician, they end up, it's amazing, all these icons are playing on Connie Mack's team. And Speaker really didn't get any love until the mid-2000s, around the time your book came out. There were two books that came out in 2006. One was by Charles Alexander Spoke, and the other one, the memory of the guy's name eclipses memory.
Maybe, was it Timothy Gay maybe did that one?
It was.
I don't know. Yeah.
It was Timothy Day, and it took 4 years for Day to write the book because of all the stuff that he did. No one at the time gave Speaker a lot of publicity because, again, he was overshadowed by Cobb and he was overshadowed by Ruth, and you remember the Christy Mathewsons and the John McGraws and the Connie Macks and the Ty Cobbs, Babe Ruths, Walter Johnson. I'm honored to speak to his grandson, Hank Thomas, who wrote the definitive biography of his grandfather, Walter Johnson, who died a few months before Hank was born. And one of the things you mentioned to me in the show, which I'm going to reiterate, was, look, Cobb was able to take advantage of anyone's weakness. He knew what Walter Johnson's weakness was. When Johnson had been a player earlier in his career and ended that guy's career, and he was so terrified because he threw so hard. I was thinking about it, so Cobb would crouch in, messing up Johnson's rhythm. And he had a lot of success against Johnson probably after 1915, 1916. Up until that time, Johnson dominated Cobb until Cobb figured out what was his weakness.
Huh.
Yeah, it's funny because I usually have Hank Thomas on my show. We talk about the dead ball era. We talk about his grandfather and all the stuff. It took him about 10 years to write the book, which he published in the mid-'90s. But hey, that's why I do these shows. This is why I have folks like you on the show. This is why the show goes over an hour, and it just seems like 10 minutes of talking.
That's how it goes when we get on baseball. But I appreciate you taking the time and covering Tying the Babe so well. I don't really have anything to add to it. I think we did it pretty thoroughly. But it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
The same here. Hang the line. Where can we find it, by the way? Is St. Martin?
It's still in print. I'm fortunate. This one is still in print with St. Martin's Press, and you can get it online from where you usually get it, or order it through your bookstore. It's still available.
Fantastic. Hold the line, Tom. I'll speak to you a minute after the show. This is how I end it, folks. Go out, get Tying the Babe. Spring training's coming, Valentine's Day's coming. Whatever you're going to do, give your loved one, whether it's a man or a woman, because I know a lot of women that love baseball, get them the gift of reading. This is a great thing. It'll keep you warm in the winter. Nice light read, nice, well-researched. To me, it's a very enjoyable book. You saw that Tom had a great time talking about it with me today, and I always love Tom on the show because his books are so well-written. Go out, get the book, have fun with it. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. As for the whole network, and, of course, Tom Stanton, and in the immortal words of one of my broadcasting heroes, Edwin R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck.